Okay, so um, a lot of talk around exclusion and stuff like that at the moment, and a big part of it, and one of the most common reason for exclusion in schools at the moment is persistent disruptive behaviour. But for me, in the vast amount of cases, persistent disruptive behaviour is a mask for a really much more underlying survival strategy that that child has taken on. And we'll talk a lot about choice and the child that chooses the behaviour. But for me, in all reality, it's just a different way of surviving and something that's outlived its usefulness. And I'll look at that in lots of different ways. So part of the training that I do is very much around all of the different reasons why children might behave in a certain way, and in the hope that I can increase empathy and I can increase understanding for staff to sort of really dig a little bit deeper. And this part of the training is more of a sort of to get people to have a think and possibly see what other reasons there might be for some of those challenging behaviours that the young people display. So um, for me, it's about motive and it's about origin and where does that behaviour originate and come from. And it's lots of different bits, but I've focused it into sort of three different areas. And you will have those young people that display that uncontrolled aggression, that panic, that immediate response, that feeling scared or perceiving threat, and it causes an immediate reaction that might be led by fear, and we often refer to that as being hijacked by their reptilian brain and the survival part of the brain with the fight, flight, freeze, and how that fight response often comes out of that in terms of aggression. Now, for me, that is motivated by a need for for self defense, and you know if a child is responding to something in self-defense because they are perceiving a genuine threat, then you know how we respond to that is really important. And I'd love to spend more time on that, but that's not what this course is about. The second one is that overwhelmed, that build up of emotions and feelings, and this take part in your limbic system, that part of the brain that is responsible for your feeling. It's built up over time, and we've all been in that position where we're fed up, and then we become frustrated, and then we become angry, and then we often lose control of ourselves in some degree. Probably not to the point of aggression or violence or really challenging behaviour, but we still feel at that point where we're not fully in control of our actions. And again, there were opportunities within that, and we do it within ourselves or we do it within our young people at school where we could have put an intervention in, but we missed the opportunity. We could have felt that frustration and gone for a walk, or we could have taken a break or something like that, but we didn't. And then it's ended up overflowing. And there's lots of analogies out there like a stress bucket and stuff like that to sort of talk about that. But that is a loss of control through the overwhelmed build up. And again, I'd love to spend some time on that. That isn't what this little segment is about. This segment is about those masked, long-term, premeditated survival strategies that young people will choose. They've had opportunities to calm down, and they've still chosen that negative behaviour. And that is a really difficult thing for staff to understand. Often it feels like they hate your subject, or they hate you, or they want to get out of your class, or they're just messing about, or all these different things. And there are lots of different factors attached to this, which we'll look at. But the fact that it's not a loss of control makes it very difficult for us to manage sometimes. So it is about long-term survival, and we're going to look about why it's about long-term survival, because all too often we focus on what the behavior is, and there there are, certain advisors that will say, that all we need is the boundaries and all that kind of stuff. But the reality is we don't know why the behaviour is happening and what's motivating it. Then how can we learn from it and fix it? So it's also about the perceptions of the children, and you'll recognize these characters in your classroom. We'll all have a devil and the clown and a monster and stuff like that, and we'll also have those children that try and hide from you, and then if we stop them from hiding, then we end up with a very unpleasant experience. So again, we've got to get about the why rather than the what, so that we can change it. Now, again, like I said, this is part of a bigger course, and within that bigger course, I'll use elements of the conflict spiral, and experiences lead to feelings, which drive behaviour, which result in reactions, and that's sort of central to all the work that I do. And we'll look at behaviours and we'll look at what the feelings are that are driving those behaviours. But for me, it all starts with experiences. So if we're looking at experiences, then we need to look at why children adopt survival strategies and why they feel they need to. Then we need to look at why they are causing us big problems. It's important that we identify what the masks are and what's really behind them. And those elements will actually not only help us to work with the young person, but be a massive benefit for us as staff in terms of our well-being and our ability to work with those young people. There's nothing worse than going home at the end of the day and feeling like the children hate you, feeling like you can't do it, feeling like your lessons are not interesting and all that kind of stuff because children are being disruptive. But if we understand that actually this is the real reason why this is happening, then that will again change our feelings on that. So it's much better for our well-being as well. So main objectives, and we're going to look at something called NARM. And NARM is a neuroaffective relational model, and it comes from something some training that I had a while back from somebody called Lisa Wisher. And Lisa Wisher, I was working as a pastoral lead. I was doing all right with the kids, and we were great relationships and all that kind of stuff. But I felt like there was something that was missing. And she came in and did some training on neuroscience and sent me down a massive rabbit hole that I've never quite managed to get out of. But within that rabbit hole, one of the pieces of research that I did was a book by Dr. Lawrence Hillier called Healing Developmental Trauma, and that talked a lot about NARM and what NARM is and all that kind of stuff, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And like I say, I'm not trying to diagnose the kids, I'm just trying to give staff the idea that something to think about and something to sort of maybe look deeper into with regard to their young people, because identifying the type of trauma and how that type of trauma results in different personality traits and different behaviors is a really important element. And if you are facing with these certain personality traits and behaviors, then maybe that's giving you a clue of where to look for that origin of that young person's behavior. Understanding the real behaviors and where they've been developed long term in order to mask true feelings. We've got to break this cycle of shame for our young people. Certainly from the perspective of the school I was in, that shame cycle was very real and very happening. And I will behave this way because I am bad. People expect me to behave this way. This is what I know. This is what I'm going to keep doing. And I'll just accept the punishments that come with it because that's what I'm used to. And that's not a healthy or safe place for a young person to be in. That's not good for us as adults, because we're never going to be able to get that young person's potential. And it's going to cause us real difficulties in terms of managing that young person. We're looking to the idea of self-acceptance, and the idea that, well, yeah, things might be rubbish now, and this, we might make, but in the future isn't set, and we can change it. And I often say, how can we expect young people to forecast success if all they've ever experienced is failure? So we have to use the opportunity that we've got to give those young people enough successes so that that's what they can actually forecast, and they actually believe that it can be different and break that shame cycle. And then we've got to give those educators more empathy and understanding, because that, again, not just for their well-being but for the young people, everybody benefits on that. It's win-win for everybody. So in terms of type of developmental trauma, and again, this links in a lot with attachment and stuff like that, those children that have been in abusive developmental areas, when they've been growing up, they've witnessed or been involved in or the victim of abuse. They won't blame the abuser. They will believe that it's their fault. I deserve this because I'm bad. Whereas other children who've been neglected, I didn't deserve that care. I didn't deserve that love. I didn't deserve that bonding because I'm bad. So either way, the child will blame themselves, and they will add to that shame of, this is my fault, and they find it very difficult to see it any other way. It's important that we look at this whole thing as a spectrum, and everybody's on there somewhere. Everybody's had parents had a parenting style that will have impacted them as a person. For many people, it's not a problem. It's not been a negative thing, but I can look at my own personality and stuff, and I can see where my parenting, my parents parented me, and I can see the links there, and and that kind of thing. So it's very interesting. You'll see a bit of yourself. You'll certainly see bits of young people that you are, but again, it's not set in stone. It's something to think about. Another important thing is it's not always anybody's fault. There are circumstances that can affect that bonding process between a parent and a child that is nobody's fault. Illnesses, periods of incubation, postnatal depression, all of these things are beyond people's control, and there's the opportunity there for repair. But when the opportunity to repair doesn't take place, that's when long-term survival strategies are needed. So we can't expect that young person to view themselves as a good person in a bad situation, because they will just blame themselves and not see themselves as worthy. So we've got certain core needs, and NARM recognises these 5, which I wouldn't disagree with necessarily. That need to interact and those relationships. We know how important relationships are. Understanding of ourselves and the world around us, and all of those different things. Trust of adults and trust of other young people, really, really important. Independence, and that that ability to do things by themselves. Not always the case if a child has been wrapped in cotton wool and not allowed to experience things. And then we need to feel that love and that bond. And if we haven't had that love and that bond in our early development, then we will then struggle with relationships and to give and receive that into adolescence and adulthood. So when we've got these things in place, we end up with a young person that feels safe, they trust, and they feel like they belong. And those are key elements, going back to things like Maslow's hierarchy and stuff going forward. Now, what happens when these things don't happen is a child has 2 choices. And when it doesn't happen on such a consistent basis, and we're talking about consistent neglect, we're talking about consistent abuse, then a child has 2 choices. And one choice is to just put it all in a box. I can't deal with all of these emotions that I've got right now. All this fear that I've got, all this frustration that I've got, all this anger towards this adult. I'm not supposed to be angry at my parents, because they're my parents. I'm not supposed to be angry at them, but I am. I can't deal with this. I'm going to put it all in a box, and you dissociate or disconnect or split, whatever terminology you want to use, but it is separating themselves from their emotions. And if a child chooses that way to go, then it's a very difficult to then bring those emotions back out again, because it's not just a case of it sounds very sensible just to get rid of all your anger and your pessimism and your fear and your frustration and stuff, and that sounds great, but the young person can't differentiate. So all your joy, all your positivity, all your creativity, all that's got to go as well, and you end up with this shell of a child that's very difficult to work with. The other option that they've got is to put on this big front and to mask their true feelings and their personality. And quite often that front is cockiness, is misbehavior, is overconfidence, is all these things that we find very, very, very challenging to work with, and often pushes our buttons in quite a dramatic fashion. And they're quite often a way of avoiding whatever it is they're being asked to do. And if we're in a difficult position and we're constantly failing at something, what's the best thing to do is to avoid it. Getting sent out is better than being found out for being stupid. Getting sent out is better than getting the work wrong and being a failure. So yes, it's a chosen behavior. Yes, it's disruptive, but the reality is it's to serve a purpose for that young person, and actually hide what's really going on. So again, your strategies have come from what we've been doing since we were cavemen, and the strategies that we had when we were cavemen of fight, flight and freeze were very successful when we were cavemen. If you were being chased by a predator, going and hiding in a cave was a really good idea. The problem is that these strategies don't work in the majority of situations that our young people are in. Fight, flight, freeze is not an adequate or useful response to something like a social situation. So hiding in a cave when there isn't a real threat, kids just asking you to go and play with them, but you might get it wrong, it's not an appropriate thing for that young person to do. So we need to give them more responses, but we need to understand that that's all they've got in their toolbox at the moment is fight, flight, freeze. We've got to give them some other stuff. And again, it's not about us as the adults, and it's not about the fact that we know it's not life-threatening. We know that there isn't a genuine threat there for that young person, but it doesn't mean that they don't perceive it. It doesn't mean that they don't feel it, and it doesn't mean that it doesnn't feel life-threatening to them. So we've got to put our own logic just to one side and forget about it at this point. We've got to look at, what they're feeling, and again, we've got to work on that over time rather than just expecting it to be just fine. And again, that social element of school, they're being fearful of putting yourself out there is a real thing for some of our young people. So NARMS looks at 5 areas and 5 different early developmental experiences and how they each one impacts in a different way. So you've got your trauma experiences, which I'll it could be things like abuse, but it could also be your things that were out of control that I mentioned earlier, the illnesses as a child. It could be postnatal depression, things like that, witnessing domestic violence. It could be all number of different things, but it's anything that interrupts that bonding process, and those vital things that happen in the first 3 years don't happen. That interaction with the adult, that learning to co-regulate and self-soothe and all of those things don't happen. So you've got a young person that doesn't know how to build relationships, and you've got a young person that doesn't know how to regulate themselves, and that causes a huge issue going forward. Then you've got physical neglect, and you know the child has a need, nobody comes, uh, and again that child then learns that their needs don't matter, that their needs aren't important, that nobody's going to come and support them and they're on their own. And again, that's going to cause them issues down the line. Then you've got your overbearing parents who possibly, you know, your stereotypes is your football dads or your dance moms, but more commonly for me, in my experience, it was parents who didn't really want to have a child, they wanted to have a friend. So they treat that young person much older than their years, and that young person often becomes quite resentful, and other things happen because of that. Then you've got your opposite of that, which is your parent that doesn't let young people experience anything. They're very overprotective, and wrap them in cotton wool. And again, you've got that resenting feeling from that young person, and we'll look at that as well. And then you've got the one that's been I've seen a huge jump in the number of children that have experienced that emotional neglect or those feelings of rejection. And not necessarily because there's more parents that are deliberately rejecting their young people, but more the fact that, you know, it's too easy now to just occupy children with technology. You don't need to actually spend the time with them. You keep them quiet doing that. You know, a quiet child is a happy child, and all of that stuff, that all the myths like that, that actually what you've again got is you've got the lack of bonding, you've got the lack of ability to regulate, and all those knock-on effects that come from that. But we'll look at each one one by one as we go. But again, I'm going to use examples and case studies of really extreme cases that I worked with, but the reality is there might be some that are on to a much lower level that have got similar experiences. But again, it's just something to think about. So really important factors: time of the child's life, you know, the amount of brain growth that takes place in the first 3 years, any developmental trauma within that phase has a catastrophic impact a lot of the time. And then the type of trauma is also quite important, you know. But all of these things, you know, from the unwanted pregnancy, you know, even before, way before birth, elevated cortisol, things like that cause massive impact on that young person. You know, those doubts, thoughts of abortion, things like that. Is there a period of incubation? I love that picture. I mean, that's Daniel, my son, and that's my finger. You know, and that was a time in my life that I don't really want to reflect too much on, but it was you know, quite the other side of that. Then we've got postnatal depression, which again, massive effect on the bonding process. Have they witnessed domestic violence? In which case, again, lots more stress, lots more cortisol, lots more fear. And then we've got rejection, and so there's lots of different elements that impact on what we've got. So I'm going to start by looking at trauma. And, you know, the trauma-based experiences, different types: unwanted pregnancy, like we've said, all those things I've just talked about. Now, what happens with these is they affect the bonding process and the ability to connect to self-soothe. So that's massive. What we will see then is a child that's boxed off those feelings. The survival strategy for this young person is to dissociate, is to split those things away, and that leaves us with a withdrawn, emotionless child that has really poor emotional literacy, because they don't see any value in feelings, because they're just causing nothing but aggro. So it's safer to avoid relationships, and often these young people will immerse themselves in fantasy or books or computer games or things like that, because they feel safer in that environment than they do in real life. And again, you've got to be careful, because, you know, children immersing themselves in fantasy and things like that is not that uncommon. But if it's to a certain degree, it might be something that's worth analyze it. So what do you see in your class? Well, this is a child that will reject relationships. Therefore, they will portray that feelings are dangerous. They don't want any kindness or affection, and they'll avoid that. They'll avoid physical touch, all of that stuff, and then they'll throw themselves into relationships and stuff. And anything that starts to build, the safest thing for them to do is to reject it, and is to sabotage it, and that is a safety mechanism that they will have, and they will be very reluctant to accept any help. You know, we often, this young person is struggling in school, let's provide some one-to-one support, but that doesn't help, that actually makes them worse. We've got a situation where this young person is choosing to freeze and avoid, or they're choosing to try and get themselves out of that situation. But if we're forcing them to stay in class, if we're forcing them to do the work, all of that stuff, then we're taking away that freeze and flight response, and that is going to leave that aggression. And this child will very rarely choose aggression as a first place that they will go. But if they're pushed, then you will see that really challenging behaviour and aggression if need be. What's the internal working model of this child? It comes from the fact that adults are scary and they'll hurt him. It's my fault that my parents didn't bond me. I can't trust adults, and then I'm worthless and I'm bad. If you're driven by this feeling unsafe, then and we've got to overcome and change those opinions. We've got to make them believe that adults aren't scary. We've got to make them believe that adults can be trusted, and we aren't going to do that by going down any kind of punitive line or anything like that. And once we start to build the trust, then we've got to build that young person up from self-esteem, low self-esteem, and go from there. It's a really long-term journey that we're going on with them. One of the children I work with was a child that he'd grown up in a house with lots of drugs, alcohol, and DV, lots of trauma experiences, to the point where mum would always side with dad, and got into a really significant incident with a brother. They were taken away, put in a special guardianship order, and from that point on, there was very little positive interaction between this child and any other adult. In school, it was incredibly difficult to build any kind of relationship. We couldn't hook him in with anything. Similarly, at home, with grandparents and stuff, he just was nothing there. He was always on the periphery of friendship groups and things like that, and he finds it very difficult to adhere to boundaries, and with lots of significant risk. And I always felt like that risk taking, those thrills, was that escape and that attempt to actually feel something, because he'd put all these feelings away somewhere, and he just needed something to, and it was really difficult to watch him struggle like he did. In the end, we managed to get him through college and things like that, and I hope he will seek support going forward and things like that. But we can't claim a success story with that particular young person. But then again, we didn't get him till he was 13. So, the sooner this work starts, the more chance it has of being successful. So, looking at neglect, individuals that have been physically neglected, well, they will learn to limit their emotional and physical needs because nobody's coming. You go into most extreme circumstances. You can look at things like Romanian orphanages and things like that. Those places were silent because those children just stopped crying. There just wasn't any point, and they knew it wasn't coming, so that they didn't even bother. And again, they'll learn to depress their own needs, and some will even lose contact with them entirely, and that's a really dangerous position to be in. but it's that general feeling of I'm unworthy of love, and it wasn't, it's my fault that nobody came, and that kind of attitude. Now, if something isn't being received, then what a lot of the time, as a strategy, this young person will then focus on the needs of others, and they'll become very astute to the needs of others, and they will often become the caregiver, and I can do that, I can take it, and that's what they will be looking to do. There'd be lots of capability, lots of resourceful children. They're used to being on the used to problem solving, used to figuring it out on their own. So they'd be very skilled at stuff like that. And often these young people go on to be in care roles when they're much older. But it's very difficult to be upbeat and positive when you've had these life experiences. So they're stuck in this hole of it's rubbish, and I'm just going to accept that it's rubbish. So anybody who tells them otherwise, it's quite a scary thing for them to try to understand. So there's a quote from somebody called Virginia Satire, and it's that most people prefer the certainty of misery to the misery of uncertainty, and that is very much where these young people will be. It's rubbish. I feel rubbish. I don't deserve to feel anything other than rubbish. And the thought of trying to be happy or trying to be positive is actually really, really scary. So I'll just stick with what I've got, if you don't mind. And that again is something that's very difficult to pull them out of. What are you going to see, with that young person, because they've taken on that kind of carer mask? I'm the shoulder everybody cries on. I don't need anything. I can take it. And that is the kind of the attitude that we're. And it's unusual for that to actually cause any real issues around school. The low mood might be a bit of an issue sometimes, but you're unlikely to see any real behaviours from this young person. But it's not a healthy position for them to be in. And when they are in a position where what's going on is, that my needs are wrong and don't matter, I don't deserve this, others are better than me, so self-esteem is really low, that's not a healthy position for this young person to be in. So, how are we going to help that person belong within that group and that class, and how are we going to build up that self-esteem for this young person? One of the children that I had, TJ, was born to a very young mother who was, had been abused herself. Mum had issues with drink and drugs and mental health, and Talia was a lot of the time left to her own devices. She was then moved to a grandparent who'd been the original abuser, and again that neglect continued. And she was constantly trying to care and make excuses for mum and grandma, but the reality was they were severely neglecting her. She ended up in a position where her brother went into a stepbrother was adopted, and rather than send her off the rails, it actually channeled her, and she did struggle, but she was so determined to help other young people that were in the same position as what she was in, and working in as an advocate for those, that she was absolutely determined. She used that as something to channel her going forwards, and I don't think she quite managed it. I think she ended up working as a nursery nurse in the end, but hopefully she'll go back to that when she's a bit older. Then you've got your overbearing parent, and they will often try to live through the child. And we've all seen the dance moms documentaries and the pageant queens and stuff like that, but just as similarly, you've got the football dads on the side, and you can do loads and loads of stereotypes with that, but it's that trying to live your life through your child kind of thing. But I found that that's a lot less common than children who are treated like adults, because they blur that relationship. And again, that's a very difficult position for that young person to be in, and it often causes an awful lot of resentment. So you've got children who are, end up very extrinsically motivated and self-serving because everything is um, about what you can get out of stuff, and they will it's purely what's in it for me to do this, and that's not an ideal position to be in, even though that might work very successfully in schools because we use a lot of extrinsic motivation and a lot of rewards and things like that, so it might suit them. Longer term, it's not good for that young person. They will be often very good at making a proper impression and selling themselves, even motivating other people, because they've been exposed to a lot of adult behavior, adult language. So they have certain skills that other children won't have, that can appear positive. But again, we've got to be very careful, because it's very easy with those skills to become manipulators, to become bullies, to become abusers. And a lot of very successful, a lot of these young people go on to be very successful in business and things like that, but very unsuccessful in relationships, and often, the abusive partner and things like that. So what do you see? You often see that manipulator, that I'm strong and in control, larger than life, manipulating other children, using other children possibly for entertainment, possibly using other children to be the one that disrupts lessons, but they're in that manipulating, leading position, and often we can see that as bullying, but there will be their own insecurities there as well, and often they will, because they've witnessed a lot of aggression, intimidation, they will use that to put others down, and that, again, that belief, which a lot of adults have, unfortunately, but certainly a lot of children have, is I can make myself feel better by making somebody else feel worse. It doesn't work, but it's again, it's something that a lot of young people and adults will adopt. What's really going on in terms of internal working model? They're resentful of others, that idea that nobody cares about me or my needs, and I've not been allowed to be a child. So you've got massive resentment. The adults in their life have let them down, so they're very much driven by mistrust of adults. And my adult at home didn't treat me properly, hasn't allowed me to do this, that, and the other. Can't be trusted. Then coming into school, fully expecting the same from the adults in the school as what the adults at home are. So we've got to try and build that trust with that young person. This child was a lonely child. Mum had mental health difficulties again, very lonely, and she saw him as somebody to be friends with rather than to be parent of, and the language was very adult, often had a sexual content that was inappropriate for his years, and it caused a big impact on him going forward. It could be, got to do things for extrinsic rewards, but never just because she'd asked him to, and that was not really a healthy position for us to be in with him. Always believed that he was right, and would not be shy of aggression and intimidation to maintain that dynamic, and that control, and he always overpowered other children, and kept them in line to do his bidding for him. And although it decreased as we managed to build that trust and that relationship, was always an undercurrent with him. Then you've got overprotective, parents who discourage that healthy display of independence, associate love with bondage, and everything is prescripted and done to please. So therefore, pleasing others becomes absolutely paramount, and that's their sole purpose, is to please adults, and that often causes a lot of resentment. But you will have those children in your class who, they constantly want reassurance, they constantly want approval, they constantly want to do your jobs, and they want to help you, and all of that stuff. But they're very scared of any kind of disapproval, and they find difficulty with boundaries, and they get involved in things that don't concern them, and then that has a knock-on effect. And similarly, what have you got if you've only been treated like a very young child? What have you got in your toolbox for when things don't go the way you want them to? And often all they've got in that toolbox is those very young children strategies of, well, I throw a tantrum works at home, so I'll throw a tantrum when things don't go my way. And I've had children that are still 13, 14, and their go-to when something goes wrong is to just throw a tantrum, and it's not an ideal situation to be in. So they will have that helper mask on. I'm perfect, I'm the nice, sweet, compliant, good boy, good girl, I'm dead proud of how much help I can be, but they get involved in everything, and that is a problem. And they're nosy and things like that can cause issue. What are they? Internal working model. I'm not allowed to think for myself. I must do what others want, and I'm jealous of the others who've got to play and explore. And they're struggling with this acceptance of who they are, acceptance of what's happened to them, and they desperately want to belong again with the other children. So I had a child that he'd been treated much younger. We still got toddler toys. He was 14 at the time. He'd always want to be helpful, volunteer for jobs, wanted to be involved in everything, but it was often at the detriment of his school life. He was always late for back from yard because he was helping somebody to deal with something, or he was getting involved in something he shouldn't be. And then when he was challenged on that, you would have the most extreme responses to that disapproval that he couldn't manage and couldn't deal with. And once we'd gone into that crisis, it was very difficult to get him out of. And then again, the last one is that emotional neglect or rejection, which is something I see over and over and over again. And it might be children that are in care. It might be children that have very rich parents who are too busy to spend time with them, so just buy them lots of nice stuff. Or more commonly and more recently, it's I'm gonna give you this piece of technology to just occupy you while I do something else. If you're quiet, that's fine, that's not a problem. But it misses out on the interactions, it misses out on the play, it misses out on the bonding, all of those different things. So that young person will often portray themselves a bit like a show off, as very confident, as overconfident to some degree. They make a big thing about material goods and objects and looking good, and being, wearing the newest labels and the best stuff, and they put the focus on objects rather than on relationships because they don't trust relationships. They will often again take risks, but rather than it being a big way of escaping things, they'll often take risks because it gets them a shot of attention from somebody, or it gets them that kudos that they need, and it's almost like a drug that they need to keep taking. They won't be able to acknowledge mistakes or show imperfections, and they don't believe relationships. So if they don't believe that relationships are real, then and eventually they're going to end, and eventually they're end in rejection, then the safest thing for them to do is, at least if they control when it ends, they can do that. So they'll sabotage those relationships. In terms of the internal working model, I wasn't wanted, people can't be trusted. I do like attention, but then if I get a relationship going, I need to end that because I'm not lovable. And again, it's a really difficult position for that young person to be in, and the safest option is often to avoid. So again, you've got a behavior that's driven by wanting to belong, but because they don't actually believe or trust it, they find it very difficult to have, and they tend to sabotage their own situations. I had a child who was an unwanted child to a very young single mum, and then when she remarried, he kind of became, he was a bit Harry Potter, a child under the stairs kind of situation, and he didn't feel like he was part of the family. and so he tended to focus on his appearance. He would wear new clothes. He would, he would use that to gain attention and approval. But then when he got the approval and the attention, he then didn't know what to do with it, and he would push it away. And he was constantly in that sort of conflicted position. And he would sell himself really well. Don't get me wrong, and get himself into successful positions, and then he'd wreck them. And that was again the position that he was in a lot of the time. So in order to change these things, so many of those elements is about having a mistrust of adults. We've got to change that. And it might be that ongoing situation at home is still that adults can't be trusted. So we've got to show in school that, well, these adults, the adults at home might not be trustworthy, but the adults in school are. And the adults in school do care about me, and they do love me, and they do want the best for me. And we've got to overcome all of those barriers that we've got. We've got to see behind the mask. We've got to work out where they are and where to focus the support. And if need be, we do have to change their internal working model. And we don't change internal working models quickly. This is a long-term survival style that we're working with here. This is a long-term response to mending it and changing it, if that's the line that we decide that we are going to go down. Your traditional, your magic wand strategies and things like that won't work for these children, because they've adopted a survival strategy for a completely different reason. Now, linking in with a sequential approach, that idea that we are rebuilding or creating safety for that young person, certain elements of that is they've got no reason to feel safe because their adults didn't keep them safe. Similarly, we've got to develop that trust because their adults haven't given them any reason to trust adults. So we've got to overcome those two things. A lot of those elements were to do with a situation within the bonding process where that co-regulation never took place. That baby that cried and was upset didn't get picked up and cuddled, and the parent's heart rate was going nice and slow while the baby is going really fast, and they learned to synchronize, and that child learned to self-regulate. That didn't take place. They were either shouted at or ignored. So in that circumstance, we've got to teach that young person how to regulate themselves in order to be able to move forwards. Now, if we've got those things in place, there's a few of those things where it's about belonging to the group that's important. That fear of rejection, that fear of failure, we've got to take those fears away, and we've got to equip them with the skills to be part of that group. And if we can make them part of that group, then that's when we can look at courageous and vulnerable learners, which is what we're striving for all of our children in school, is those courageous, vulnerable learners. But how can you be courageous and vulnerable when you don't feel safe, you don't trust, you can't keep yourself calm, and you're constantly fearing rejection off your peers? It's not a position that he's going to be in. So a step-by-step approach is so important. But also, if we have safety and trust in place, then let's start at regulation. We don't have to start at the bottom. We can start somewhere else. So if we triage what's behind the mask and what's actually the root cause, and if we've got a fairly good idea of where the origin of the behavior is, we can work out where to start in terms of repairing. And we talk about children being emotionally resilient, and that being sort of the goal for our children all the time. It's a phrase that gets thrown around all the time, but what actually is it? Well, it has lots of different elements for me. I've got 7 parts to my version of emotional resilience. Emotional regulation and impulse control, massive issues if you've got a young person that's on the ADHD spectrum for a start, but also, if they haven't got regulation, and they haven't got that skill, and they've never been taught that skill, then we have to teach that skill. and we start by teaching it, you know, where it's teacher led, and then hopefully from there we can learn to teach that child to self-regulate. Realistic optimism is very difficult if all you've had is failure. You know, how can we expect children to be optimistic if all they've got is reason to be pessimistic? So we've got to take that child from low self-esteem and boost them up, and make them believe in themselves and make them believe that they can actually be successful. Then you've got flexible thinking and empathy, which again, if you've got a young person that is on the ASD spectrum, then flexible thinking and empathy can be a real challenge. It's not that they're not possible, but they will be difficult to achieve, and something that we've got to work on. But similarly, if they're desperate for belonging, then those are components of getting other children to let you belong within the group. And then finally, we've got bounce back ability and the ability to overcome obstacles, which, you know, if you keep getting knocked down enough times, it becomes harder and harder to get back up. And then how do you put yourself out there and make yourself vulnerable if you don't envisage there's any chance of success? You know, if we went around a room of adults and asked them to name something that they've achieved in their life where they hadn't had to make themselves vulnerable in order to get there, they're probably massively struggling. You know, going on that first date, going on that job interview, asking somebody to marry you, you would never have done those things unless you believed there was some possibility that the outcome was going to be positive. And children who are stuck in cycles where they don't believe that it can be positive, they just won't put themselves out there. So, you know, if we're looking at courage and vulnerability, we've got to have the other things in place. So, you know, that's NARM in a nutshell, dead quick, you know, and it ties into lots of other things that I would be doing. But I think it's really useful for just having a think about, well, what is the origin of this young person's difficulty in their behaviour and these personality traits that they've got. And it's obviously difficult because they might experience more than one experience that they've got, you know, and things like that, the different levels that they will have experienced too. But I've certainly found that really useful in my role that I was in that there was always something missing within those young people, and I was like, well, what do I think is causing that? Okay, so that like I say, that persistent disruptive behavior, such a phrase that gets thrown about so much, an excuse for so many different things, but what actually is it? Well, chances are it's probably a mask that's a long-term survival strategy.